This is Batia Wiesenfeld, and I want to welcome everyone to another session of our Faculty Insights on COVID-19. Today, we have a focus on small business and entrepreneurship, and we have with us Manasa Gopal from our finance department and Deepak Hegde from management. And Manasa has been doing some terrific research on financing for small businesses. And Deepak, of course, is running our Endless Frontier Labs, which is a really exciting new accelerator for tech-based startups and has been directly involved in helping startups in New York through the Berkeley Center, where he also is the director, figure out how to navigate this situation, the coronavirus calamity. And so we have some real expertise, and it's clear that COVID is directly impacting these small businesses and entrepreneurial ventures. So Manasa, I wonder if you could share your screen and begin with your presentation, then we'll turn it to Deepak and then open it up to questions. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box.
It's great to be here, Batia. Thank you for organizing this session. I think, as you mentioned, clearly COVID has had a huge impact on small businesses. And in my talk, I largely want to focus on the extent of damage due to COVID on small businesses and potentially talk about how we can aid small businesses in getting through this crisis. And the reason the focus is on small businesses is because aggregate economic recovery is going to be very closely tied to how small businesses perform. Right? The reason this is because small businesses, which are defined as firms that have fewer than 500 employees, are actually 97% of all businesses in the US. And nearly 3/4 of these businesses actually have fewer than 10 employees. So we're talking about very small businesses that contribute a huge fraction of the US economy. Not only are they large in terms of the number of firms, but actually they contribute nearly half of all of US employment. Right? So basically aggregate employment is going to be very closely tied to how small business employment moves. And this is also because small businesses not only contribute to aggregate employment, they contribute towards new job growth. So annually, about half of the new jobs that are created in the economy come from small businesses. So really, all of this just makes the point that if we want aggregate economic recovery, we need to really focus on how small businesses are performing. And this is important because if you see in the last few months, small businesses have been largely affected by the effect of COVID, right? So in the 1 month after COVID was declared a national emergency, revenue at small businesses fell over 45%. Right? So we've seen some initial recovery in the past month and a half, but it's nowhere close to what the pre-COVID levels were. So the revenues at small businesses are now still over 26% below what was the average pre-COVID. And while revenues have gone down at small businesses, the costs that small businesses face have not fallen at the same rate. Right? So what this means is that earnings at small businesses have taken a big hit. So by April 15th, earnings at small businesses were 60% below their average level in other years. And again, even though we see some sort of recovery, we're still almost 40% below where we would want to be. Right? So as revenues fall and costs stay the same, as earnings drop at small businesses, most of this loss has been transferred to the employees of small businesses. Right? So if you look at hourly employment and small businesses, this is again dropped over 60% in just 1 month after COVID was declared an emergency. And still, it's right now at the end of May, about 40% below the levels we would like. Now, the reason all of this is a big problem for small businesses is they're not really equipped to handle these large shocks, right? So small businesses don't have much cash on hand to be able to accommodate large drops in revenues and earnings. Nearly 3/4 of small businesses, when surveyed at the end of April, said they have less than 2 months of cash in hand for operational expenses. And if we expect that this crisis will continue for a few months, which seems like most small businesses do, so almost 90% of small businesses believe it will take them over 2 months to get back to normal operations. And for a third of them, it's over 6 months to get back to normal operations. We need to find some way to compensate small businesses for this loss that they're facing. And typically, firms rely on banks for access to financing. But what we've noticed in the past is that especially in recessions, it becomes very hard for small businesses to access traditional sources of financing. So if we just look at the last recession, small business lending fell by over 40% after 2007. And in the last 10 years, as the economy has grown, as overall bank lending has grown way past 2007 levels, the lending to small businesses from banks has still not recovered to the levels they were at pre-financial crisis. Right? So what we have now are businesses with a big drop in revenue, no cash on hand to accommodate these losses. They can't access traditional sources of financing from banks that they typically might. So they're being, in some sense, attacked from all directions. Right? So we need some sort of support to ensure that small businesses can actually survive this crisis. And obviously, this was something I think policymakers understood very early on. So in late March, when the CARES Act was passed, a significant portion of money, so around $349 billion, was earmarked for small businesses under the Paycheck Protection Program. These were largely 100% federally guaranteed loans meant to be provided to small businesses to ensure that they can maintain payroll and continue operations. So these loans were going to be dispersed through banks, and borrowers could borrow up to 2.5 times their monthly expenses to cover payroll, mortgage or rent expenses, and utilities, and so on. And these loans had extremely attractive terms. So only 1% interest rates on loans for up to 2 years. Borrowers did not have to show any collateral. They didn't have to show proof that they couldn't access other sources of funding, just to ensure that all small businesses could tap into these loans. But probably what made the Paycheck Protection Program so attractive was that these loans could actually be forgiven. Right? So if businesses spent the money on payroll and mortgage and rent and utilities and so on, this amount would actually be forgiven by the government. And since the focus was on maintaining payroll, businesses were expected to spend about 75% of the money that they received on maintaining employment. So as I said, obviously the great thing about PPP was that it was implemented early on, but there were large issues with the Paycheck Protection Program that became obvious pretty early on. Right? So one of the big things was the size of the program. As I mentioned early on, 97% of the businesses in the US are classified as small. So they could have potentially been eligible for loans through the PPP. And there is no way $349 billion would cover 2 months of expenses for this large number of firms in the US who required the funding. Right, so we estimated about $810 billion would be needed to cover operations of small businesses for 8 weeks. And essentially, when this was implemented, it became clear early on that there aren't sufficient funds. Right? So the $349 billion that were earmarked ran out in less than 2 weeks. And because of this, Congress passed an additional $310 billion for small businesses about 10 days later. But what seemed to happen over time is businesses were getting more and more confused about what it is they were getting into. So in the 2 months after PPP was announced, there have been 14 sets of different rules on eligibility for these loans, on eligibility for loan forgiveness. And surveys by the National Federation of Independent Business shown that basically 3/4 of businesses actually confused about whether their loans will be forgiven. And half the businesses feel like they can't actually spend the money in 8 weeks because of shelter in place and lockdown orders preventing them from operating. And all of this confusion led to a drop in borrower interest for these loans. And the second round of PPP actually still has about $130 billion left, even though initially it was thought that $310 billion would run out in less than a week. Now, because of this drop in demand and because of all of this confusion at small businesses, just last weekend, there were some new rules that were passed to make the PPP more attractive to small businesses and make sure they actually tap into these funds. So instead of having to spend 75% on payroll like before, now firms need to only spend 60% on payroll. And they've been given 24 weeks to use funds instead of 8 weeks. And at the same time, initially, there was penalties to small businesses if they were not rehiring their workers. Now, exceptions have been made to that rule if the employee refuses to be rehired. All of this to ensure that small businesses do tap into the PPP and to make sure we can rehire employees as was the goal. But probably the largest issue with the PPP was that there were no clear rules or guidelines as to which businesses should be prioritized in the loan program. Right? So it was left to the discretion of banks to decide who they want to approve loans for. And anecdotally, there is a lot of evidence that banks prioritized their customers, especially their larger ones, and a lot of small businesses were left unable to access the PPP. And this is not very surprising when you look at the long academic literature that has argued that relationships between banks and firms is actually very important for access to financing, especially in periods of distress. Right? So small businesses need to have strong ties to their banks to be able to access funding. And borrowers without relationship were essentially left out. And one other potential reason that complicated this was that banks were being paid fees by the government for these loan approvals, and the fees were in proportion to the size of the loan that was being made. So this naturally also biased banks to approve larger loans, which meant larger firms were getting these loans. And if we actually look at the data, this becomes clear pretty easily. So what we see is a lot of the small businesses in, say, the Midwest and the southern states were more likely to get loans under the PPP, even though potentially regions in the Northeast were affected more by COVID. Right? In fact, actually, there is almost no correlation between the severity of COVID in a state and the share of businesses that received loans. And one potential way to target these loans could have been to actually focus on which businesses were more affected by the lockdown and shelter-in-place orders. The idea here being that, when shelter-in-place was implemented and everyone had to work remotely, some firms could continue operating as per usual, but some of them were severely affected because their operations could just not be done remotely. So there is academic work to create indices on the extent of the effect of shelter-in-place orders on different industries. So if we had done that, we could potentially have targeted these loans towards businesses that were most in need of the loans at this point. And one of the reasons to do that is we see that at least on the surface, it does look like loans to smaller businesses through the PPP improved employment rates in these states. Right. So, of course, this is very preliminary data. So we don't entirely know, one, if these gains are actually going to be permanent or if it's just a temporary gain in employment. So ideally, we want to ensure that these workers are retained in the long run, but we have to see what happens once the PPP funds run out and after 8 weeks, whether these employees are going to be retained. And we have to also identify whether these gains are actually coming through the PPP loan acceptance or because a lot of economies are now opening up and loosening shelter-in-place and lockdown orders. I want to spend maybe a couple of minutes just contrasting how the US has responded to the crisis compared to how other developed countries have responded. So I think largely there have been two strands. One, like the US, where they've opened up unemployment insurance benefits to workers who would have traditionally not been able to tap into them. So basically, even employees that are not actively seeking employment can now get unemployment insurance. The other strand, which has been followed by most of the European nations, is actually to pay firms to ensure that they retain their workers. Right? So countries like France, where they've actually made sure that if an employee is furloughed, the government will cover about 84% of the wages as long as the firm retains its employees and pays them benefits. In Netherlands, again, 90% of the payroll costs for companies would be covered for firms that saw a small drop in revenue. New Zealand also similarly paid employers a fixed amount per employee to make sure that they were retained on their payrolls and to make sure that a certain level of their wages were being continuously paid. Australia, Switzerland, Germany, Ireland, all of them have followed similar programs. And what we actually see is this has led to two very different responses, right? So the countries that spent more on a lot of these short-term work programs or to fund employers directly to retain their employees have seen a much slower growth in unemployment rate compared to the US, where by far there's been the largest growth in unemployment rate because the funding was not directed through employers to retain employees. So this, I think, largely leads to the question of what the goal of such a program should have been. Right? So if the goal is to make sure that workers are retained on employer payrolls and to make sure that when the economy restarts, these businesses can restart operations immediately because you don't spend time rehiring and retraining workers, then maybe we could potentially have directed money to firms instead of to employees through unemployment insurance benefits. So I'm going to hand it over to Deepak now, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions at the end.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot, Manasa, for your presentation, and thank you, Batia, for your introduction and for leading the Faculty Insight series with Viral. I've learned a lot from the series, which has helped crystallize all of our thoughts on really important matters during a period of unprecedented uncertainty. So thank you, and very excited to be contributing to the conversation today. Manasa talked about COVID's impact on small businesses, and I will be focusing on COVID-19's impact on new businesses, which typically are also born small. So, of course, there may be differences, but what I am going to be talking about now is going to be COVID's impact on a subset of the companies that Manasa touched on during her talk. So why care about startups, right? Startups are well known as the engines of economic growth. Between 1980 and 2010, startups, defined as businesses less than a year old, generated 2.9 million jobs every year in the United States. This was 1/6 of the gross jobs generated by all establishments and nearly all of the net jobs created in the US economy. The implication, of course, is that cohorts of older firms typically exhibit net job declines, and startups are essential to add jobs to the economy as they have done over the past 30 years or so, for which we have this data. The second reason we care about startups is they disproportionately contribute to research and innovation, as well as productivity growth in the US. If you take many examples, such as the airplane, the railroad, the automobile, electric service, telegraph, telephone, computers, air conditioning, and so on, each of these were started up by innovative, young, new firms and ended up fundamentally transforming consumers' lives, but also became platforms for many industries to enhance productivity. One staggering statistic is that, in fact, 85% of the R&D spending in the US today is conducted by VC-backed startups born between 1974 and 2015. So really, startups at the moment of founding, as well as through years of their growth, add disproportionately to R&D, innovation, and productivity growth. Third, startups are known to enhance reallocated efficiency. What that means is that startups exhibit an up or out dynamic. Innovative and successful startups grow rapidly and become a wellspring of jobs and economic growth, or they can quickly fail and exit the market, allowing capital to be put to more productive uses. So startups really enhance the ability for resources to flow freely to where is most beneficial. In an economy where reallocated efficiency is high, more productive companies grow, while less productive firms contract or possibly exit the economy. A great example of startups and reallocated efficiency is actually the medium that is facilitating our conversation today. Zoom was born in 2010 when Eric Yuan, then the lead of Cisco's WebEx group, was deeply dissatisfied with WebEx. For those of you who have used WebEx, you will know that the WebEx conference service required you to sign up and then identify the system that you were signing up from, which really slowed things down. And too many people on the line would have to strain the connection, leading to choppy audio and video as well. And obviously, the service completely lacked modern features like screen sharing for mobile and so on. So Yuan really wanted to improve the product at Cisco, the WebEx team that he was heading, but he was really not prioritized within the company at all. And this led to his starting Zoom in 2010. The company IPO'd in 2019 April, and today, after COVID, the company enjoys a market cap of about $58 billion, nearly more than the combined market cap of 3 of the US's largest airlines, highlighting how quickly startups can seize on opportunities as well as grow in response to what might turn out to be a different set of ideal circumstances in the face of changes such as the pandemic. So 3 main reasons why we need to care about startups. What has COVID done to startups? So what I'll do, as Manasa implicitly did, is peer back into looking at how entrepreneurship, the formation, financing, and performance of new businesses was impacted by previous recessions, primarily the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And then produce some very preliminary data on COVID-19's impact on startups. And we will bring these 2 things together to understand in what ways COVID-19's impact on startups compares or contrasts with the experience of startups during the previous recession. And based on this, we'll try to quickly speculate about what the future might look like for startups and entrepreneurship in light of COVID-19. So the Great Recession of 2008-2009 saw a 20% decline in new firm formation, from about 700,000 in 2007 to about 560,000 in 2010. This was, by all means, one of the sharpest declines seen in the history of the United States, other than during the Depression of the 1920s. You will also see that although there was a recession following the burst of the internet bubble in 2000, 2001, the impact in terms of new businesses started, the impact was not all that high relative to the Great Depression, Great Recession of 2008, 2009. We also look at another measure of activity, startup activity, which is venture financing. Venture capital in the United States accounts for a large proportion of the successful startups. And what we can see here is that during the recession of 2008, 2009, venture financing dropped from about $45 billion in 2008 to $31 billion in 2009, a 31% drop in 1 year. Interestingly, deal count, which is generally considered as indicative or at least correlated with allocations for startups, new allocations for startups, right, more or less stayed the same at about 5,800 to 5,900 deals per year. What this meant is that in light of the last recession, overall funding contracted, but deal activity measured by their frequency remained the same. This basically means that the average of size of the deal contracted. So VCs were effectively writing smaller checks for startups in light of the contraction. So that was kind of the primary effect over the last crisis. We can also look at another measure of startup financing, which is startup financing at the seed or Series A stage. Generally, startups bring on their first round of institutional investors during the seed or the Series A stage. And what you see here as well is about a 30% drop in seed stage financing from 2008 to 2009. What you also see, however, is that the number of deals, seed and Series A stage deals dropped, which meant that very likely the companies that were seeking financing for the first time during this period were the most hit through the contraction of VC financing. So obviously the rate of startup financing and formation came down during the last recession. Obviously, we care deeply not just about the rate of startup formation, but also about the quality of startups. So a key question then is, does startup quality go up during recessions? One argument for why the startup quality might go up is basically because during slumps, there might be a positive selection effect, right? If you assume that VCs can somehow discriminate between really high potential startups and less high potential startups, then if they have less money to deploy, they're going to go after the best deals. So basically, maybe it's going to be the best startups that are able to survive and thrive during recessions. And if that is the case, we should actually expect startup quality to go up. But on the other hand, there is the larger economic environment that really depresses demand, makes it maybe hard to access the sort of talent that might, because they fear uncertainty and don't want to take risk, are less likely to work for startups. And the general freezing of the capital markets might also mean that startups may not be able to raise the funding to invest in their plan A's, further sort of affecting their quality. So basically, it's kind of an empirical question, and there's not a whole lot of good research on whether startup quality goes up or down during recessions. Many, obviously, those who are particularly excited by startups suggest suggest and point to the examples of companies like these: Dropbox, Groupon, Uber, WhatsApp, which were all born during the last recession, to suggest that maybe the quality of startups that come out during recessions is going to be particularly high. There are also other great examples. Microsoft was born during 1975, Disney during 1923, General Motors during 1908, and General Electric during 1890, all times of deep downturns. So we really don't know. So this is kind of one hypothesis. And recently, there was about 3 weeks ago, The Economist put out an article that spoke to this particular aspect. And the article suggested that almost 500 of today's biggest listed firms in America, whose origins date back as far as 1857, a majority of them seem to have started their life in expansionary years than during recessions. So basically, of those founded since 1970, more than 4/5 that survive on the Fortune 500 today were born during expansionary times rather than during recessionary times. This then suggests that perhaps the folklore that startups born during recessions tend to be of high quality does not hold up to a closer scrutiny with a larger sample. There is some recent evidence also being put together. My colleague in the finance department, Sabrina Howell, which looks at patents taken out by startups during recessions and suggests that patents taken out by startups that are backed by VCs during recessions tend to be less important, less technologically impactful, and less closely related to fundamental science. Also, more in line of than of the economist sort of hypothesis that there is a pullback in startup quality during recessionary times. So it seems like overall the weight of evidence, imperfect as it is, seems to suggest that startup quality actually declines during recessionary times. There's also a third key effect on startups, which is the direction of activity pursued by startups during recessionary times. And what we see is that at least during the Great Recession of 08-09, there was a big contraction in startups that were pursuing information technology ideas. So basically, typically the number hovers around 50%. 50% of the venture financing goes to ID companies, but during the recession, that number came down to about 35%, and hovered between 34 and 40%. Okay, and then gradually started picking back up as the economy expanded. So it seems like at least during the 08-09 recession, there was a pullback on IT investments, even as a relative proportion of VC funding. Now, the other sort of effect is on the differential impact of recessions on different startup ecosystems. The big ecosystems in the United States are the one in orange here, which is Silicon Valley, the West Coast broadly. The second largest ecosystem right now is actually the New York ecosystem that is indicated here in blue to include the New York DC belt. And then the Boston, New England ecosystem now is the third largest in terms of overall venture activity. And what we find here is that, interestingly, during recessions, at least, there is a pullback in activity that happens in maybe the Northeast. It seems like the 2008-2010 recession particularly impacted New York, the New York region, startups in the New York region, as well as in the New England region. The difference being that New York seems to have recovered handsomely in the expansionary years, whereas Boston seems to have had more of a difficulty in regaining its place as effectively the second largest ecosystem in the United States. So it seems like very likely through the channel of sectoral investments, recessions also have an impact on the geography of startups. So overall, what we have learned then from past recessions, in particular the 2008-2009 recession, is that recessions lead to a decline in startup founding rates, about a 20 to 30% decline in the past Great Recession, a decline in average startup quality, a decline in IT startup investments, and possibly a decline in Northeast startup investments. So now we can turn to kind of COVID, and with the little data we have, try to see whether and to what extent the patterns we see in the data reflect what happened during the previous recession. So here's new firm formation, particularly this is new firm filings by those who are likely to take employees on their payrolls, the type of startups that generate jobs and we care about. What you see here was an unprecedented decline in new firm filings from about 30,000 per week in week 9 to 19,000 per week in week 10 of this year. This was basically the first week of March when Corona's effect was kind of really starting to kind of kick in. And you see kind of the unprecedented nature of the decline. It's not even anywhere comparable to the declines even during 2009. Okay, so there was about a 4 to 5 week period when the declines persisted, really record levels in terms of the hit to startup activity. And then eventually, the good news is over the last 2 to 3 weeks, we have started to see a pullback where we are actually seeing a return to the numbers as was the case during an expansionary year, 2019 May. So right now we are at a point where it seems like we have recovered. The second aspect then is venture funding. And if you look at venture activity as well, we see a decline here from about $13.5 billion to $11 billion in April. So it seems like much of the activity was felt in April, not in March, obviously, because startups get into conversations early and it takes about a month given the due diligence, et cetera, for activities to close. So likely, the reason why you don't see an impact in March numbers for VC funding is that most of these deals were essentially kind of closed during previous months, or at least committed during previous months. You see a sharp decline in April, but then a very handsome pullback in May. Okay, and this data is basically hot off the press. So it is current till end May, and we are seeing a very good recovery. There is, however, a decline in the number of deals, which very likely means that VCs are effectively writing bigger checks for existing companies and are probably not investing in new deals, at least relative to what generally happens during expansionary periods or normal times. This is confirmed when we look at funding numbers for seed stage companies, where you see a sharp decline in new deals from 343 in the month of March to 223 in the month of April, holding steady in the month of May as well. So it seems like there's a contraction in new firm financing, seed financing, that doesn't seem to have really recovered even in the month of May, although there also you see a slight sort of uptick in the overall figures, if not in the deal numbers. In terms of the sectoral allocations, what you see here is kind of rather remarkable and stands in contrast to the effect of the previous recession, where IT investments were among the first to be hit. You can see here that startups that are pursuing IT-based ideas have actually maintained their relative share and even grew their relative share when the contraction happened massively. Overall contraction of VC funding happened massively in April, growing their share to 48%, which is really kind of remarkable. May numbers, it seems like ID investments have kind of decreased, but usually there's some sort of reallocations and refining that gets done by PitchBook. Likely many of the companies that are being categorized as B2C here are tech-enabled and are likely to end up as ID investments here. But at least when the decline was the sharpest in April, you see that IT grew its relative share of financing. Likewise, maybe related to the fortunes of IT, Silicon Valley seems to have grown its strength, COVID-19, relative strength. COVID-19 seems to have increased the proportion of investments that Silicon Valley-based startups seem to have enjoyed. And obviously, there seems to be a halting of the march, the constant upward trajectory that New York-based startups were sort of on since COVID-19. And you see a pullback in New York numbers here. So it seems like, for a variety of reasons, Silicon Valley startups seem to thrive even in the face of COVID. So a summary then of COVID: unprecedented decline in new firm formation in March and April, with a sharp rebound in May. Venture funding declined sharply in April, but also seems to have rebounded back in May in terms of the overall numbers, if not in terms of the number of deals. IT startups seem to have increased their relative share of venture financing during the downsizing. Silicon Valley startups also seem to have increased their share of venture financing during downsizing. What may not have been evident in the bar charts that I showed, because the overall share of finance-related startups tends to be relatively lower, is a sharp pullback in venture financing for financial service startups. Going down from a high of about 6 to 8% of all venture investments to 1 to 2% of all venture capital investments during April. So that seems to be a huge pullback as well. So overall, where we stand, it seems to me that looking ahead, we are right now facing a fork in the road. And I think two scenarios are equally plausible and can play out. The first scenario is the more drastic one, where there is a wave 2 of the pandemic with some of the numbers in terms of job losses and worse still, deaths kind of return to what we were seeing in late March. And if that happens, very likely the rebound that we saw in the data is likely to be short-lived, and you will see an unprecedented decline in startup formation. What you saw in early March was absolutely kind of staggering. And if we have a few months of that type of a contraction, I think we are looking at losing an entire generation of startups here in the United States. Very likely, if the patterns from the last recession holds under this drastic scenario, you will also see a lower average quality of startups. You will see tremendous bargaining hands in the hands of power in the hands of investors who are willing to deploy their dry powder, and you will see the return of investor-friendly terms. And you will see, obviously, a decrease in valuation numbers for the startups as well. I think relatively well shielded will be IT startups. And if you think about IT technology, what it does really, right, the pandemic has been unprecedented in terms of either completely reducing or definitely having an impact on our ability to communicate. And what information technology does is really it reduces the communication costs, if you will. And that's why it's been such a powerful substitute in these times. And we can expect the relative strength of IT to hold. And I feel possibly given Silicon Valley's dominance as the place where new information technologies get generated, as well as the likely effect on the financial sector, New York City's growth as probably the fastest growing startup hub may be halted. But on the other hand, the recent numbers look good. And if we continue on our present trajectory, where the pandemic spread is relatively well controlled, then we are likely to see a quick rebound and recovery in startup formation. We are already seeing it in the data. And the missing generation of startups and ideas we suggested will kind of likely be limited to the ones that really have to exit the market suboptimally because of about a month of sharp contraction. ID startups will still continue to thrive, perhaps because of social distancing and all other measures that will likely have to be in place, affecting communication costs. and New York City might be able to pull back and regain its prominence as the fastest emerging hub for startups. So that's what we have, and very much hoping for wave 2 while not necessarily expecting it.
Thank you both so much for such really thoughtful and insightful ideas and data with respect to both small business and entrepreneurial firms. I wanted to, just to kind of start out, I'm wondering about I'd like to pose some questions. One of the things that both of you highlighted is how dependent these startups are on financing, and startups and small firms are on financing. And Manasa really highlighted the fragility of these small firms, and at the same time highlighted the fact that so much of our employment is dependent on these small firms. And I guess I'm wondering so Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you find out who is swimming naked. Does COVID kind of help us to understand a level of fragility among our smaller firms and perhaps among our newer firms that is unhealthy? Or is this actually a good thing in terms of that in fact we expect this sector to be more agile, to have this reallocative efficiency that Deepak highlighted? So I guess the first question is there a level of fragility that is not appropriate? Especially Manasa highlighted the need to have relationships with banks. So it sounds like it's not just what you know, but who you know, not just how good you are, but their faith in you. So what should we be thinking about? Should there be policy changes? Should we be doing things differently in terms of recognizing that we're dependent on these smaller firms and newer firms, especially for employment, and yet they seem so fragile?
Great. Manasa, do you want to go first, or?
Okay, so I guess one thing potentially is, even in normal times, I think we see that small businesses, younger businesses fail very often. And of course, I think at one level, that's a good thing. You don't want resources allocated to inefficient businesses. I think about 10% of businesses fail in their first year, right? So there is a large reallocation even in normal times. I think the question is, if a lot of this largely depends on, say, something like the relationships that you have, which take a while to form, then it is not evident that these are worse businesses, but potentially just businesses that don't have the right connections yet. Because it takes a while for banks to start initiating credit relationships with smaller businesses, be it in terms of, giving credit lines, having accounts, having normal term loans. Banks tend to do that for firms that have existed for a while because they like knowing that these businesses will stick around. So you need to have sufficient history of good cash flows to be able to access financing. And however good a firm you are, it takes a while to establish that history.
Great. So just to add to what Manasa said, Batia, your question of whether kind of the fragility that we are seeing in the data, particularly with respect to the US, is a good or a bad. I think it's a great question, and really, in my view at least, depends on the reasons for the downturn. I think we see job losses, during downturns. It is natural. It's the process of creative destruction. But if many of the downturns are precisely brought about because of inefficiencies in the system. And basically, the downturns then play the role of reaching the market back to a new, better equilibrium. And if you take the downturn of 2001, right, 2001, that was on the back of a massive inflation in values of software startups, even while there was no pathway for them to be creating the type of value that was being suggested by the stock market valuations of these companies. We saw a downturn. We saw a reallocation of capital, and arguably that was a good. Likewise, during 2008, 2009, there were some excesses on the financial side, and there were other inefficiencies as well, which got corrected immediately, arguably, at least in the long run. And probably then the fragility, in fact, led to the creation of a more robust system. I think COVID-19 has been fundamentally different in the sense that what has been brought upon us has not been due to any fundamental inefficiency, economic inefficiency, but it's a health shock. And so it is less clear than that policies that at least keep this fragility or at least do not do anything to address it will have the same benefits as might have happened during other recessions. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Let me pose two questions that came from my partner, Viral. And so those two questions are, should we be thinking about the decline that you highlighted, Deepak, in these startups, the COVID-related decline, as just mothballing, or is it possible that some of this is really a permanent loss? And you kind of highlighted these two different directions where it seemed like you were suggesting that what happens in the next couple of months is going to determine those two. So that's kind of the first question. And then the second one is it not just about financing, but also COVID-related disruptions in productivity? And I feel like that one, we could actually see that being just as relevant to small businesses, and maybe some of the ones that are failing might be in industries where it is, for example, more hospitality, more restaurants, et cetera, in industries where it's going to be really hard to become productive back again. And so what are those two different effects? Maybe the first question, Deepak, you might start out with. The second question, Manasa might start out with.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot, Viral. The question about whether what we are seeing is kind of mothballing versus a permanent loss, right? At least up until now, at least based on my conversations with the VCs, it very much seems to be more along the lines of what you call mothballing. So VCs are saying we are still interested in looking at startups. We want to be kind of chatting with them. We want to have our radars out. We will be very cautious, but we are not closed for business, is what they're saying. Okay, so at least on the whole, that seems to be the case. And then part of it really kind of, goes to the life cycle of venture firms, where generally they get money from limited partners and have funds that have a term of about 10 years. So in fact, at least technically, the amount of dry powder that they have to deploy has not taken as much of a hit because of COVID-19. So that might explain kind of why this might seem more of a mothballing effect currently. But at the same time, there's also evidence of permanent loss. And particularly kind of even in the data, I highlighted that the sharpest contraction or pullback has been in terms of funding startups. At the seed stage. Seed stage is kind of the first time the startups are approaching the institutional investors. And I know, for example, startups with maybe 1 or 2 business employees that they absolutely needed to be paid, to keep the startup going, right? It was not going to happen, even as many of these employees who were running labs, for instance, could not go into the labs, and the startups could not afford to pay these unproductive employees, even if they were the only person on their team. And they had to basically get rid of them. And I think there are some of those cases also, obviously, that suggest that there have been permanent losses. And really, it's a matter of time. I feel the longer this prolongs and the more likely we return to the drastic world scenario, the more of the permanent losses we will see. But right now, by and large, it seems to be a mothballing effect.
And so, Manasa, maybe you could address the question of, do we think that there are productivity losses? I know also part of what Deepak referred to is a digitalization. We've certainly gone through a digitalization. Working from home, remote work, the question is it more or less productive? Obviously, a lot of businesses can't do work from home. CEOs are telling us that work from home is even more, they're having productivity gains in work from home. I wonder if you think that these COVID-related disruptions are coming from productivity changes.
So I think that's a great question. So it is something I alluded to briefly in the talk, which is about, COVID has differential effects across different industries, different firms based on their ability to remote work, right? So a lot of, say, tech firms are able to continue working or actually even be more productive working from home, while there are businesses that just cannot do any of their operations remotely. And one of the reasons for maybe differential targeting of these business loans would have been helpful was if work was continuing as normal, if earnings and revenues at certain businesses were continued to staying flat, maybe they don't need government assistance as much as businesses that have lost their ability to continue working. Because potentially it's useful to have airlines and restaurants around when we come back from the crisis, even if they're not particularly productive at this point, because there's just one, drop in demand, and two, they're just not able to work when everything is under lockdown. So I think at some level, they need assistance to survive this crisis, because at the end of it, we want them to survive. So potentially people will still take flights after, COVID has found a treatment.
So as we're getting to the top of the hour, one last question that I think really interests everybody who's got an NYU Stern connection, which is, are there things that can be done in New York or in the Northeast, in our area, to help to support small businesses and entrepreneurial firms? Are there things that you'd like to see from a policy standpoint, from a financing standpoint, or any other perspective that would help to buffer New York, sort of put New York back on the right trajectory?
So I don't know if this is New York specific, but I think one thing that has potentially been noticed is even when the economy is opening up, it's not necessarily that small businesses are back to having levels of revenue that they had pre-crisis, because consumer demand still needs to go up, right? So maybe potentially one way of helping small businesses is to actually redirect some of the demand towards small businesses. And I think at least around NYU, there are a lot of them. So I think that's one way to potentially improve outcomes at smaller businesses.
Anything you want to add, Deepak, as the head of our Endless Frontier Labs and therefore invested in the future of entrepreneurship in New York City?
Now, New York has always been a great place for entrepreneurial activity. I think the big difference between Silicon Valley and New York is that Silicon Valley somehow has managed to acquire a reputation of building startups that seem relatively well shielded from economic upturns and downturns, for better or for worse. And the role of universities has always been very important, because universities generate scientific and technological innovations that can create or improve productivity in the long run. So in fact, then for New York to be very much the same, up until now, it appears much of New York's uptick in entrepreneurial activity has been driven by the markets here, the businesses, rather than the push sort of strategy. But for New York policymakers to acknowledge and recognize that our universities are amazing and can equally contribute to entrepreneurship as they have done in Silicon Valley would be phenomenal. It would also make us more robust, I think, in the longer run.
Thank you both so much for such a terrific session. It was full of insight and definitely got, it sounds like we need to all be doing more to support our small businesses and entrepreneurial firms. Thank you very much, and we'll see everyone next week.
Thank you, Batia. Thank you, Manasa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.